In React, we're working with JSX. We worked with JSX all the time here in this course already. In this course project, which we worked on in the last course module, which you find attached to this lecture, by the way, in case you didn't follow along, you can simply download it, extract it, run npm install and npm start, and you're good to go. In that project, we of course used JSX. JSX is that code you return in your components, which in the end will be rendered to the real DOM by React. That's what JSX is, and we use it all the time. But JSX has certain limitations. Specifically, there is one limitation which we also already faced in this course. If we have adjacent root level JSX elements, like in this example, we'll get an error. And with root level, I mean that we have two JSX elements next to each other, not wrapped by another JSX element, and we then return these side-by-side JSX elements, or we try to store them in variables. This will not work, because in React, in JSX in general, you can't have more than one root JSX element. So if you return a value, or if you store a value in a variable, or in a constant, or in a property, that value must only be exactly one JSX element, not 2 or 3 or 4 side-by-side adjacent elements. Now, that one element which you are allowed to have may of course have more children, which then also can be adjacent to each other. But that topmost element, which you're storing or returning, must only be one element. And the reason for that is actually not that difficult to understand, because this also isn't valid JavaScript. You can't return more than one thing in JavaScript either. You can return one number, not two. You can return one string, not two. Of course, you could return an array, and there you could have multiple numbers, but an array is already a new value. An array is just an object, so you still only return one array, one object, not two arrays at the same time. Right? So that is really important to understand here. Your JSX code translates into React create element, like you see it here at the bottom of the slide. And you must only have one React create element call which you return. Now, any nested JSX elements, so inside of that one root element, could be side by side, because in the React create element world, those children of that root element would be the third and fourth and fifth and so on argument. And that's something I had a closer look at in the basics module, where we explored how JSX translates into React create element calls. But because of that natural limitation of JavaScript, we must only have one root JSX element. Now, how can we work around that? There is one solution, and actually we can already use that solution here in that add user component in that provided project which you find attached. Here I do have a wrapping div, and that is a workaround. You can solve this problem by simply wrapping the adjacent elements with a div. If you do that, if you wrap them with a div, then you only have one thing that you return, only one value. It's a bit like returning 3 numbers by putting them into an array. Here we're returning 2 nested JSX elements by putting them into one div, which we return. Now, this also doesn't have to be a div. You could be using any element here. You could also be using a custom component here. The main thing that matters is that you only have one value which you return or which you store in a constant. And that's also what we're doing here. Now, there actually is also an alternative to that. Instead of using a div, we could use a native JavaScript array. I could remove my opening and closing div tags and put my card component here and that dynamic expression here into an array separated by commas. I just would need to remove these curly braces here because we're no longer inside of JSX here, we're inside of an array. That would be valid, but this has a little gotcha. We can return an array because React is able to work with arrays of JSX elements. We did utilize that when we output our list of users here, or also earlier in the course you learned about mapping arrays of data to JSX elements in the lists and conditionals module. So React knows how to work with arrays of JSX elements, and hence of course here we could also return such an array of JSX elements. If we do that, and we preview this application, we do get a warning though. Because whenever you're working with an array of JSX elements, React wants a key on every element. And that's no exception here. It wants that key if you map dynamically through a list of data and map that data to JSX elements. But it also wants such a key if you have a hard-coded array of JSX elements, as we have it here. Now, of course, we can simply add a key. And since this is not generated dynamically, we can hard code keys here, error modal, for example, and add user card. We could add the key prop with our own invented values, and we would be fine. And that would be perfectly fine. But typically, you don't use this solution because adding those keys, wrapping it in an array, is a little bit cumbersome. It's way easier to simply add a wrapping div here, like we had it before. So I can just go back to that, add my div here, and now wrap this here back into curly braces, and remove the comma here, because now we have a dynamic expression inside of JSX again, so we need the curly braces to evaluate this expression. So that's simply more convenient, and therefore typically we use the wrapping div. However, with the wrapping div, or generally any wrapping element, a new problem arises. Now we can end up with div soup. So we can end up with a real DOM that's being rendered where you have many nested React components, and all those components for various reasons need wrapping divs or other wrapping components. And you have all these unnecessary divs being rendered in the real DOM, even though they're only there because of this requirement or this limitation of JSX. And this is not an unrealistic scenario. In bigger applications, it's very possible that in your final HTML page, which is being served to your end users, you have a lot of unnecessary divs or other elements which are only there because you needed them as wrappers, even though they don't add any semantic or structural meaning to your page. Now, of course, you don't have to care about that. You might be fine with that, but it could break your styling. If you have a wrapping div somewhere and you use nested CSS selectors, that div could break stylings. And even if it doesn't break your styling, it's still not a good practice. You're rendering too many HTML elements, and ultimately that also makes your application slower because the browser needs to render all those elements and React needs to check all those elements, or at least some of those elements, if content needs to change. So rendering unnecessary content is generally never a good idea in programming. Hence, this wrapping div or this wrapping element approach is okay, but not ideal.